All right, so we're going to take a look at a comparison between Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. So both of these men and their political parties, they were very supportive of George Washington as president for 2 terms, even though they had very different uh, ideas about what government should look like. But they believed that Washington was the main figure that unified the country, and Washington was kind of universally admired. Remember, Hamilton had worked as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and Jefferson had worked as Washington's Secretary of State. And these two men and the political parties that formed around them. This is what we call the first party system. In this country, we traditionally have two major parties. Like, for example, in today's world, we have the Democrats and then we have Republicans. Well, our first two political parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. This is called the first party system. And again, both of these groups were really active in recruiting supporters, right? Even though Washington wasn't a big fan of political parties, they still developed under his administration. And Hamilton recruited supporters by using kind of government jobs and contracts. And, because the Federalists controlled Congress at the time, and so they used their powers to give out government jobs to reward people with support, contracts, that sort of thing. And the Democratic Republicans, because they didn't have the same kind of government power that the Federalists enjoyed during the Washington administration, they started to get followers and supporters by forming committees that coordinated at the local and state levels to make sure they were coordinating and kind of having caucuses and meetings, to kind of get people to support the Democratic Republican ideas. It should be noted, though, that in both cases with these political parties, they believe that their vision, their ideas, were the ones that represented the best interests of the country. Because we had never had a political party system before, there was this belief that there shouldn't be multiple kind of viewpoints, that there could only be like one kind of right way of doing things. And both the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans believed that what they offered the country was the best way to maintain what had been started under the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. All right, so now let's look at the differences, and I think the differences are probably more significant here. Um, so I've have these three categories here: their vision of America, the role of government, and the fact that we're the first political parties. So in green here, the similarities. These are the first political parties. Now in orange, over here, these are differences. And notice how I have them as a matched pair here. That way you can talk about their vision for America and see exactly where they contrasted with each other. So starting with Hamiltonian Federalists, they saw that their vision for America was a America that was based on cities and urban life, commercial trade, merchants, banking, that sort of thing, business interests, right? They tend to favor the elites. They were kind of had an elitist outlook, what you call aristocratic. They believed that you couldn't trust the regular people. They were too unpredictable. Hamilton famously called the people turbulent and ever changing. And so they wanted to have systems like the Electoral College or state legislatures appointing senators to try and minimize the influence of kind of regular people on the government. And Federalists tended to find their supporters in the North and East. This is where the cities were, cities like Boston, New York City, those kinds of places. On the other hand, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, their vision for America was of an agrarian lifestyle. Agrarian means farming based, right? Jefferson saw the future for America lying in a basis on small farmers. He saw that as a less centralized country where everybody would have their own farm, and that would kind of keep the country more settled, more less concentrated power in wealth in the hands of certain people. And so the people who tended to favor the Democratic Republicans tended to live in the South and West. These are heavily agricultural areas. So the West would be the places that Kentucky and Tennessee and what used to be called the Ohio River Valley, where the west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay. Our next category is the role of government. Both political parties had a different vision for what the role of government should be, in terms of what the power of government should be. So Hamilton and the Federalists believed that the country should have a strong central government. They wanted to have a government where power was more concentrated in the national government, not as much in the state governments. This means that they saw Congress having an expansive view. So the elastic clause in Congress, the necessary and proper clause, they believed that power could be stretched so the Congress could do various things to make sure it could use its powers in the Constitution. And one of those, for example, would be like the National Bank. Hamilton believed that the National Bank was necessary to fulfill this kind of commercial outlook of the country. And he believed that Congress had the power to create it based on the necessary and proper clause. On the other hand, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they wanted straight states to have a stronger say. So a lot of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans used to be what are called the anti-federalist in the ratification debate or the ratification of the Constitution. And they're the ones that were concerned about a powerful central government that would take away the rights of individuals. So they wanted to see state and local governments have more power because they thought that state governments knew their people better than the national government did. Every state was different. Virginia was a very different state than Massachusetts. And so therefore Jefferson and Democratic Republicans believed that state should kind of handle most of the responsibility. And so because they favored a stronger state government, they wanted to limit the powers of Congress. They didn't want Congress to have an expansive set of powers. They wanted to limit to what the Constitution actually said. So they were strict interpreters of the Constitution. Now, in terms of actual government policies for the role of government, Hamilton and the Federalists, they wanted to pay off the government debt at full value. And so this meant that during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had issued kind of bonds or kind of IOUs, borrowing money to pay for things during the Revolutionary War. And so some ordinary Americans, they lent the government money. But when things weren't going well, there was an economic depression. Some of those ordinary people said, you know what, this piece of paper is going to be worthless. There's no way the government pays it back. So they kind of sold it to somebody and said, here, this is worth $100, but it's not going to be paid off. So here, I'll sell it to you for $20 or whatever. And then somebody buys that all up. And so what ended up happening is wealthy speculators bought up a bunch of those pieces of paper. And when the Constitution was written and Hamilton kind of came in, he said, you know what, we're going to take those, we're going to pay them off with their full value of $100. And so those people who were able to buy up all those pieces of paper early on, they could make a lot of money. So Hamilton wanted to pay off those debts at full value. But on the other hand, the Jeffersonian Democrats and Democratic Republicans did not want to. They said, that's not right. They should pay the original owners, not these speculators that just came in and bought the money and took advantage of those people that needed cash at the time. So they felt like, and that kind of goes along with this idea of the common people versus the aristocratic kind of elites, right? So because who was able to afford buying these at a lower cost during the economic depression? People who already had money. And who needed the money were these kind of regular common people. Okay. Hamilton and the Federalists also wanted the state debts to be all combined into one national debt, because Hamilton essentially wanted the country to have a good credit score. Think of it that way, right? They wanted to, if the country could show that it paid their bills back, then that would mean people in other countries would lend it to the United States. So this is the way to establish that. Okay. Whereas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they thought that was unfair because some states, like Virginia, for example, had paid off all or most of their debt. And other states, which tended to be in the North, owed more money. So they felt that wasn't fair, that was a kind of a free ride for some of those northern states. And again, look where the federal support is in the North and East. Okay, the final kind of plan for Hamilton here is he wanted a tax on whiskey to raise money for the government, right? Because to pay off that national debt or to do things that the government needed to do, they needed money, and so decided to have a tax on whiskey. And this tax on whiskey was opposed by many of the Democratic Republicans because it hurt farmers, they felt, because a lot of farmers, any extra corn and rye that they had, they turned that into whiskey. It was their most profitable product. So when Hamilton's trying to tax the thing that they made the most of their money on, that made them kind of upset. And we ended up with Whiskey Rebellion, which I've talked about previously. Okay. And finally, I didn't include this one of the three categories, but it's something to consider is they both had a different outlook on kind of foreign policy, particularly with regard to the French Revolution here. So Hamilton and the Federalists, they saw the French Revolution, which was kind of going on around this time in the 1790s. They saw the French Revolution as kind of chaotic and what they call mob rule. Okay, the mob meaning like a big giant riot and just nothing constructive was happening there. People, this is the reign of terror. Think of Robespierre if you learned about that in a previous history class. This idea of the French Revolution was like chopping people's heads off. It was chaotic. They were kind of very, very strict and not, and they, there was no sense of stability there, and so they saw that as just chaos. Whereas the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, they saw the French Revolution as a democratic expression, which in a way kind of makes sense because in the French Revolution, they wrote what's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which used a lot of the same ideas as the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. So they saw the French Revolution as kind of a companion revolution to the American Revolution, continuing that spirit. Okay. There are some other similarities and differences, particularly differences here, but I think this gets an idea of when we're looking at their impact on the country. They both had a very different vision for America. They both had a very, very different idea of the role of government, but these did become the first political parties of the country and the first party system.